All right, so on this lecture, we're going to be talking about faith and non-faith identity, as well as faith oppression. So before we get started with the lecture, there's some terms that we need to go over before we can really jump into some of the readings and into some information. So I just highlighted them all here. The first one we're going to go over is theist. So theist is a person who identifies with a belief in a higher power or in a deity. Now, someone who's an atheist is someone who lacks the belief in a higher power. Now, something I do want to make note of with atheist, commonly, the common definition around atheism is someone who does not even believe in a deity or higher power. To some extent, that is true, but something about non-religious, it gets into the non-religious spectrum. So I'll jump right over right here. And non-religious is basically just used to describe the spectrum of non-faith identities. So when we think about atheism, um, it's more so a lack of belief, not necessarily no belief at all. Agnostic, this is identifiable within the non-religious spectrum. So if you look at the definition here, it's a person who believes that the knowledge or presence of a higher power or powers is unknown or unknowable. So with agnostic, the common misconceptions about folks who identify as agnostic is that they're either a rather soft atheist or just straddling the fence, and that's actually a misconception. With agnostics, uh, it's just it's more so comfortability with uncertainty of the presence of a deity or higher power. The religious none. This is a term just used to describe a person who doesn't identify with the religion. So the religious none is more so straddling on the fence of religious and non-religious to some extent. They're kind of within the middle. Secular, this is a term that's used to describe things that aren't really religious in orientation. So anything that is not religious is secular. Spiritual but not religious, SNBR. This is basically a term that a person uses to identify with a spiritual life stance, but not necessarily with an organized religion. So the point is, you can be spiritual, you might believe in the presence of a higher power, and not really identify with any organized religion, such as Catholicism, Judaism, and so forth and so on. Another term that's going to be pretty much talked about is Christian hegemony. And this is the cultural assumptions, norms, and beliefs that have Protestant Christian origins. And granted, when we're going to talk about faith, the privileged identity is Christianity. Now, I do want to make note that granted, there's a spectrum, I say spectrum, but there's different sections of Christianity. And something to make note, the privilege of Christianity is Protestant Christianity. And we're going to talk about why that is in a minute when we get to the history. But overall, these are the terms. The point of this particular slide is to show that religious and non-religious identities are on a spectrum. You can be a very theist, in which you strongly believe in that. And you can be on the other side of the spectrum as an atheist, where there's the greater lack of belief. There's a greater certainty that there is no higher power. So overall, when you think about religiosity and non-religiosity, it's a spectrum, not necessarily a dichotomy. It's not that you're just simply a hard you're just one or the other. It's spectrum. Another thing that we have to talk about before we move forward is talking about the religious landscape within America. Now, something to make note, uh, the largest religion practiced within the United States is Christianity. Now, something to make note is uh, there actually is a decrease in Christianity. So, taken together, there's growing secularity within the United States. There's decreasing numbers of Christianity. People are leaving the Christian faith. When it comes to race and religious identification, something to make note is that within the Christian identification, there's a greater representation of US Black Americans, followed by Latinx folks and white folks. That was something that the PEW survey did. I'll send y'all the link about that because it's really a cool survey, and it should be in your book as well. So what are some reasons as to why this is happening? What is it with the changing landscape in the United States? Well, several factors. When you think about the generation, so people who are younger adults, they're more so leaving the organized religions and just identifying either with with uh, with a nun, so they don't identify with the religion, or they become non-religious in nature. And something to make note, with the greater use of technology, people have more access to information, more access to knowledge, and that facilitates how people make their decisions about faith. So what I'm saying is, with people who are younger adults, given that they're in a more society that they're in a society that where there's greater technology, there's greater access to knowledge, you're seeing a greater report of non-religion, or with the identification as a religious nun. Now, compare that to folks who did not have as much access to technology and access to knowledge. You think about your baby boomers, your older adults, to some extent, people who are middle-aged adults. They typically are within they typically make up the Christian, or they make up the religious identification, most notably the Christian faith, or Christian faith, and particularly um, Protestant, Baptist, so forth and so on. There's also notes that people might be switching faith. So people might be leaving Christianity to become, to identify with the Judas faith, the Jewish faith, to identify with Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever it may be. So let me go back. So overall, what we have seen within the past past 6 years, 6 to 7 years or so, we're seeing that the United States is changing in religious landscape. Now, making note, while there are decreasing numbers of Christianity, Christianity still remains the dominant, the most dominant, dominantly practiced faith. So now we're going to be talking about faith oppression, and I mentioned Christians are part of the privileged group. Now, with that, there's even levels of privilege within Christianity. So when you think about Protestant Christians, when we get to race, and when we get to the history, Protestant Christians are the most privileged group out of all the Christians, whereas people who identify as Catholic or Methodist or any of the uh, Pentecostals, not necessarily appreciated as much. And when I say appreciated, I mean not that they don't have as much privilege. But let's go ahead and talk about Christian privilege. So let's start here. You can expect to have time off work to celebrate religious holidays. So let's think about Christmas, for example. Christmas, we know, is centered um, around the birth of uh, Jesus of Nazareth, and also people get a good bit of time off for a celebration of this particular holiday. And this is just one big example, and I wonder what are some other holidays that you get off or you know that you can celebrate. Okay, music and television programs pertaining to your religion's holiday are readily accessible. Um, when it gets to be around November, uh, December, you typically start seeing Christmas commercials. You see Christmas specials, and they are mostly centered around the Christian faith. Can you recall a time where you saw the Islamic faith, their holidays being celebrated on TV? What about the Jewish faith? So another big one, holidays celebrating your faith are so widely supported, you often forget they're limited to your faith. When you think about something as small as saying Merry Christmas, when you say that, it portrays this assumption that that person is also a Christian. They may not be a Christian. They may be atheist. They may be agnostic. They may be they may identify as a Muslim. The point being is that when with Christian privilege, in particular this example, there's the assumption that someone is identifying with the Christian faith. Another example, you can worship freely without fear or violence or threats. So when you think about people who are celebrating their Christian God or their faith in public, it is typically free to do so. And most people just simply are like, okay, this person's doing this in public. Okay, that's a thing. Also, something to make note. You see a lot of it within. You can see it within schools. You can see it within football games. Something, as an example, is at our football games at Louisiana Tech. We pray. We pray Christian. We pray with the Christian faith, and we pray over the teams. We pray over for good health. And something to make note: Louisiana Tech is a secular organization. It's a secular institution, and so something to think about is if you've ever gone to a football game or if you've ever been at an event at Tech where there was prayer said, was there any reference to the Islamic faith, the Jewish faith? Okay. Positive references to your faith are seen a dozen times a day by everyone, regardless of their faith. When we think about the portrayal of Christians within the media, right? The assumption is that Christians, quote unquote, are good folks. There's a lot of movies and films and television shows that depict Christianity in a very positive light. Now, some of that has been changing, but the majority of it, when you compare it to other faiths, there's greater positive portrayals of Christianity and Christians than there are people who, than non-Christian practitioners and non-Christian faiths. Politicians can make decisions citing your faith without being labeled as heretics or extremists. This is a really big one. Consider politicians who identify as pro-life. Many of them cite Christian faith as their decisions to be pro-life. So within the media, there's a tendency there's a tendency to uplift that person, whereas someone who like if I'm remembering correctly, Senator Omar, people stigmatize her for her faith and also for her race, really her other identities as well. And when she cites her own belief, people see her as extremist. People see her as biased. When we have a lot of politicians who identify with the Christian faith, and we don't label them as such. Another one, it's easy for you to find your faith accurately depicted in television, movies, books, or in other media. So that kind of goes hand in hand with these positive references to your faith. In the event of the divorce, the judge won't immediately grant custody of your child to your ex because of your faith. When we think about people who are non-Christian, and this includes people who are non-religious. So think of someone who's an atheist. They're more likely to not have custody of their child simply because the judge, or simply because of the faith and non-faith. And so something to make note about faith, right? Depending upon the faith, it can be a concealable identity. Atheism, agnosticism, any non-religious identity, and to some extent Buddhism, if there isn't any worn religious icons, it's a concealable identity. Now with atheism, agnosticism, and other non-religious identities, they do constitute as concealable stigmatized identities, in that until the identity is revealed, they don't experience discrimination. But more on that a little bit later. So now we're going to talk about the phases of religious oppression. Hold on 1 minute here. So remember when we talked about the phases of oppression, we're going to be talking about the phases of religious oppression. So the first one that we have is powerlessness. So basically, the subordinated groups have less access to social power than members of the dominant group. When we think about decision-making, for example, right, going back to the political system, politicians, for example, judges have cited, even though they cite being they cite themselves as being unbiased with their religious values, there's some privilege in that. Oops, let me go back here. And what I mean by that is when you think about pro-life laws, like I mentioned before, commonly cited is the Christian faith, and people don't necessarily label them as there aren't any. Let me say that. Let me back up. There aren't any repercussions to that. And what you also see is that even further, and it's not just pro-life, it's making decisions about what is being portrayed in schools. You, quote unquote, you have "In God We Trust" on the dollar bill, or not dollar bill, on cash, right? You also have, we also say one nation under God within the pledge, the Pledge of Allegiance. And something to make note, that wasn't added, that wasn't always there. That particular part was added within the 1950s, around the 1950s. And don't cite me on the time of the history. And it was used as a way to unite the nation against Russia. All right, historical foundations and colonial periods. When we think about, oops, go back, dang it. When you think about the indigenous people, right, and their interactions with missionaries, missionaries would coerce this group of people to accept Christianity. Their hair would be cut, they would be assimilated into European culture, and Christianity was forced to be, Christianity was forced upon this group of people. We saw something very similar with the African slaves, where their faith was forced to be forgotten, and Christianity was forced upon them. Exploitation. Going back to the work and the interaction between indigenous people and Black and African slaves and European settlers, a lot of the historical literature cited that. And when I mean historical literature, I'm talking about the accounts of European colonizers making note that it was their job to almost convert people to Christianity, and the way to do so was through submission. So all these groups were forced to submit to the Christian faith, and that was used as a justification that these Black and brown folks needed to be saved. And there were cited passages within the Bible that were used for this justification. The story of Ham, and something to make note. That was a commonly cited passage, or the story of Ham was a common reason for the justification of the subjugation of Black and brown folks. So even going further with child slavery, you had slave ships with Christian names. Now, within that same realm, you had abolitionists who were using Christian faith as means to freedom. We talked about it before within the racism chapter, manifest destiny. So manifest destiny is more so an idea that it's U.S. Americans' God-given right to expand the United States from east to west. And this led into the killing, the taking of indigenous land within that's really pushed by this idea of manifest destiny. So the discourse of natural resources such as forest, when the European colonizers, they met with the indigenous people had a specific way of life, in that one was to live with nature and respect nature. And there was a lot of spiritual life within nature. And European colonizers, they were like, nope, not dealing with that. Instead, what they saw was that this wasn't spiritual at all. It can be used for farming. It can be used for profit. And so this is just an example of the ways in which even further indigenous people experienced his exploitation, and their faith was disregarded simply for being communitarian. It's meant for everybody. Where with European values, it was meant, and European colonizers, they were there to expand the European colonies through competition. Marginalization. So anyone who identifies as non-Protestant Christians, they are the targets. When we think about schools, right? Within schools, you typically see Christian idols. Now, granted, in private schools, that's what's there, right? If you're in a private Christian school, private Catholic school, whatever it may be, you're going to see those icons, right? Those Christian icons. And within public schools, there is still the reference of the Christian faith. This side of the pledge. There are laws that include "In God We Trust" within the mottos. Louisiana is actually one of them. There's also the push to, quote unquote, keep God in schools. Well, when you think about it, public schools, they're not, they are to be secular. Separation of church and state, right? But that's often not, while it is enforced with other non-Protestant Christian faiths, when it is with Protestant Christian faith or concepts, it's not enforced. Curricular hegemony. So something to make note, there's something really interesting in how we teach faith and what we teach about it. In that, when we talk about historical U.S. American figures, there's typically the reference in that they are, there's a reference in that they are Christian and that they are good. And anyone who was not was considered to be un-American. Within the same vein, holidays and traditions and accomplishments, right? Holidays is a big one, given that people get time off for Christian holidays. People celebrate Christian holidays. When we think about when we think about Valentine's Day, Saint Valentine is typically is commonly referenced, right? When it comes to traditions, holiday traditions, Thanksgiving, you say the prayer, you gather around like quote unquote the Pilgrims did, and you bless the food with your faith. Oh, dang it. Excuse the different points. So let's see here. I already talked about the Pledge of Allegiance. The deculturalization and schooling of Native peoples. So I referenced this a little bit in the last slide, but overall, just to really highlight the marginalization of indigenous peoples. With the forced confiscation of their land, a lot of aspects of their culture was undermined, the languages, their identities, especially that of their spiritual faith, right? They were forced to forget that, forced to unlearn it. And within schooling, indigenous children were sent to schools, these missionary schools. Their hair was cut and they were forced to learn Christianity. And they went back to their tribes and was like, hey, look, this is Christianity. This is a really cool thing. And then you had them basically being used as means to assimilate the rest of their tribe. In a nutshell. Now, going to the Christian privilege, right? So I don't know why I did that. That's so weird. Ignore me. Ignore my slides. But overall, this is all about cultural imperialism. And talking about Christian privilege in particular, when we think about the world calendar, the Gregorian calendar is set for the Christian faith. So when we think about BC, right, the idea was that Jesus of Nazareth, right, was born in 4 BC. And with that, with the conversion to the Gregorian calendar by the Romans, um, well, the Romans were very. Hold on, let me get my history straight. So, in the beginning with Christianity was more of a grassroots faith, and it wasn't until Constantine set it to be the like the quote unquote national faith, and then following suit, Christianity became like very noteworthy, and the world calendar was pretty much set for Christianity. So overall, while we know the Earth is not just like 2020 years old, right? It's a lot older than that. We set it. We set the time. We set the date based around Christianity. Also, when we think about our work week, right? It's set up to celebrate the Sabbath. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Friday's your day off. Friday you get off, and then Saturday, Sunday to practice the Sabbath, right? Just as examples. So overall, when we look at Christianity as a whole, there is a lot of examples of cultural imperialism. And I wanted to highlight this because this isn't something that's really known. One nation under God was not added in the pledge until 1954. Ding, All right. So violence. When it comes to religious violence, we have seen an increase in increased religious violence against people who are Jewish, people who are Sikh, and people who are Muslim. In the past, we have seen historical violence against non-Christian faiths, such as we just talked about the exploitation of the indigenous people. We also talked about when you think about the Crusades, a lot of Islamic practitioners were killed in that slaughter. And so these are just examples. Within recent years, we have seen that there has been a greater increase in religious hate crimes within the past 4 years. And so I'll give you these slides to really go over them, but just to show you some statistics on this particular topic. So here, if you go to the Jewish Virtual Library, they do provide some information about different faiths and about, in particular, the Jewish faith, right? So if you look here, in 2018, 16,039 law enforcement agencies participated in hate crime stats. Of these agencies, 2,026 reported 7,120 hate crimes involving 8,496 offenses. So when we look at that, there are hate crimes, but I'll be very frank, these are typically underreported. And overall, when we think about people who are Jewish, people who are Islamic, right? You do see instances where there is a lot of intimidation. And of note, Jewish folks were more likely to be intimidated. So I'm curious, what do y'all think about that? Is this something that y'all knew? Yeah. So let's go ahead and go back to our slides here. No, go back to the slide. Share. Oh, crap. Never mind. All right. So when we think about these different faces, right, we have to consider the intersection of them, in particular between faith and race. So going back real quick, when we think about this interaction, right, people who identify as white and Protestant Christian, someone who might be called, might be notarized as, not notarized, but might be called as WASP. So WASP is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Protestant folks, okay? So what you typically see is people who identify as Protestant Christian are rather white. And it's a predominantly white Christian denomination and rich. So even further, when we think about, let's see, when we think about Black Christians, right? While Black folks may be overwhelmingly, there's a overrepresentation of Black folks within the Christian faith, and the thing about that is, there's the argument within the literature is that it's a lot lower, and that people who are atheists of color, especially Black atheists, are concealing their identity to avoid the stigma around being Black or being a person of color and an atheist at the same within the same time. So now we're going to talk about faith oppression within the United States. This is documented in U.S. American history, where you've seen the marginalization of religious minority groups. When you think about indigenous peoples and African slaves, for example, Christian-based divisions. So people who have Christians who have identified as Catholic, they have been persecuted and even further marginalized simply because of their specific beliefs in regards to Christianity. Baptists as well. People who identify as Muslim, within the recent years, you've seen hate crimes against people who are Muslim, against Muslims. And even further, negative portrayals of Muslims within the media, and within discourse as well. And other non-Christian faiths, not too much portrayals against people, not too much positive portrayals of people who are Jewish, right? And people who are Hindu and people who are Buddhist. And a lot of times these portrayals are that they're, when you think about the portrayal of Jewish folks, right? They're portrayed as penny pinchers, big noses, they talk in a very odd manner. And even further with people who identify as Jewish, right? We've seen that there's an increase in violence against people who are Jewish. Marginalization of non-religious groups. So this is a big one in that typically a lot of times we don't consider non-religious groups within the United States as being stigmatized, right? And something I do want to be clear about, when you think about non-religious peoples, it's predominantly, they are more likely to identify as white. And when you look at atheists, for example, atheists are overwhelmingly white, male, and of higher educational attainment. Now, here's the thing though, people who are women, people who are or racial ethnic minority, right? And identify as non-religious, they do experience a stigma simply for being atheist or non-religious in nature. So when we remember, something to think about is when we talk about intersectionality, we have to consider all the, or when we talk about a person or oppression, we have to consider all the different identities that a person holds. So while atheists are predominantly white and male and highly educated, um, there are privileged identities that buffer that stigma. And compared to people who are not white, people who are not man identified, people who have lower educational attainment and lower SES. Something to make note, though, for atheists are a very stigmatized group within the United States. Now, a lot of stigma-related research around atheists have focused on, you guessed it, atheists, not so much on people who are agnostic and spiritual but non-religious, or any non-religious identities. So when we think about Christian hegemony in the United States, this operates at the individual and interpersonal level, where you have Christian privilege. And we talked a little bit about those at the beginning. When you think about naming, clothing, right? These are just some signs. You might have a person of Jewish faith hide their Star of David icon, or hide their Jewish icons, or symbols. You might also see um, uh, some hesitation around people who are wearing hijabs. Um, excuse me. It also operates at the systemic level within the political system, religious institutions, and gatherings. And I'll say this about the I'll say this with about religious institutions. You do see a lot of influence from religious institutions on the political system. Historically, you've seen that. Whether it is, um, well, let me back up here. So during the civil rights movement, for example, or even really before that, you had people who are Christians arguing for the separation of races, not necessarily for integration. Now, one of the most noteworthy Christians is Dr. Martin Luther King. And something to remember is that he used faith in a way to make the argument that integration is really important. Malcolm X, though not a Christian, he came from a rather different place, right? In his later years, he became more identified with the Muslim faith, and you had a lot of people move away from him given his religious identity. But overall, what you saw within the civil rights movement was the use of Abrahamic faiths such as Christianity and Islam to argue for the integration of races. Now, when we think about hold on, that might be something for a little bit later. What we do see is the presence of wealthy Christian folks involved within the political system. And when we get to the religious right, we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about that extensively. You also see the visibility of Christian nationalist organizations. Overall, when you have people who are just overwhelmingly Christian and advocate for Christian supremacy, so forth and so on, right? And even further, white supremacy, what you tend to see, there's the tendency to allow them to be more visible than needed. When it comes to Muslim nationalist organizations, immediately you see the conversation become very different. You see people really arguing against them. You see people who are who actively, I say people, but I mean, you see a heavier police force or heavier attention to those organizations instead of those who are Christian nationalist organizations. And when it comes to non-religious groups in particular, there is a lot of stigma for being non-religious and even further being atheist. Um, uh, in certain states, atheists cannot run for a political office simply because they're atheists. Um, and I was curious. I'm curious how much did y'all know that? Um, and something to make note within the literature. Um, within the literature, so here's the thing about psychology. So there has been documented, there's been a documented association between religiosity and mental health. So what that means is greater levels of religiosity are also correlated with greater levels of mental health, well-being, so forth and so on. And the thing about that is it pushed this assumption that people who are um, people who are not religious are more likely to have lower mental health. And a lot of times it was a lot of, not even a lot of times, people cited some bias in regards to how these studies were done and how they conceptualized atheists, agnostics, and anyone who was on the non-religious spectrum. And what we find is that people who identify as atheist um, and people who identify as theists. So people who are really high on atheism and people who are really high on theism, in particular Christian faith, right? They actually report comparable levels of mental health and psychological well-being compared to anyone that's in between in the non-religious spectrum. So it seems to be that, and that's just a misconception that atheists are just depressed folks and they like to just complain. That's not the case. That's everything but the opposite. So we have seen historical patterns of faith oppression, right? When we think about persecutions, right? Prior to the origins of the United States, Christians were persecuted for their beliefs, and it wasn't until Christianity became a national identity that you saw the decreased rates of persecution. Now, moving to the United States, right? People who identified as pagans, people who identified as, moving closer to, oh, hold on, let me backtrack. So people who identify as pagans, um, their identity as pagans constituted some stigma in that their faith wasn't recognized anymore, and at the same time um, they were being seen as heretics, they were being seen as ungodly. And so with that, when you saw the Christian faith as being the national identity, you saw the undermining of other faiths. Now, moving into the United States in particular, and the Salem witch trials, for example, where you saw the killings of a lot of people, especially women, simply because they were quote unquote witches. When it comes to, oops, I forgot that one. When it comes to genocides, right? People had typically cited the genocide, the attempted genocide in particular of the indigenous people. The religious justification being that it being that it's to promote Christianity, to promote the word of God. Um, and as a result of that, you had a lot of people of indigenous uh, of indigenous origins, heritage, die because of that justification. So the intersections of faith and race, right? Um, Protestantism has been historically racialized. When we think about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASP, and something to even make further note is that they are rather rich and once again, talking about the exploitation and marginalization of um, indigenous peoples and African slaves, uh, what we see within the history of colonization is not only their oppression, but also, yes, we see their oppression in that they were forced to unlearn their faith, um, and an important part of their culture, and seeing that there's a greater and see in the result in that they identify as Christian. When we think about the conversion of African slaves to Christianity, right? Now we do have a large part of U.S. Black Americans um, identifying as Christians, and even further, though. Some researchers have argued that it's used as a coping strategy with racial oppression. And the literature is actually pretty mixed on it, in that in some cases, some research has found that it buffers racial stress, and it might exacerbate racial stress depending upon the type of coping strategy, whether it's positive, whether if it's positive, it's going to weaken that stress. And if it's negative, it's going to um, heighten that stress. So positive religious coping strategies would be helpful in buffering racial stress. And in other cases, negative religious coping strategies would heighten that stress. Now, that's the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that there has been no association between religious coping strategies and racial stress. So taken together, when we look at coping strategies as a whole, religious coping strategies as a whole within the Black community in particular, it's mixed. So Christianity in current day law, education, and policy, there's a lot of emphasis on religious freedom within U.S. American history. Even now we see that. But something to make note is that a lot of this religious freedom or this emphasis comes from Christians. When you think about saying Merry Christmas, right? You've always heard people say Merry Christmas. Not anything different. Or you've seen signs, keep Christ and Christmas. Now, think about that. If you're not Christian, imagine that message, keep Christ and Christmas. Um, that's just that's an interesting point. You even see the sectarian accommodation of Christianity, where you think about the work days, the work week, right? It's all these are all to accommodate people who identify as Christians. When people who are Muslim need to take time off for their religious holiday, it's typically seen as unprofessional, and it's not even accommodated. Christianity has served as the umbrella for identity. When you think about the United States, one of the emphasis that you see is on Christianity, the practice of the Christian faith, right? Not necessarily of other faiths or non-faiths. People who are suspected to be atheist, right? They are labeled as un-American, and that's one example. There are many examples about other non-Christian faiths being labeled as un-American. When we think about the separation of church and state and the First Amendment, right? These two typically clash, in that within the public school system, what you see is the inclusion of the Christian faith and the exclusion of non-Christian faiths. And I mean, I would say non-religious identity, but the point is to be secular, right? We have In God We Trust. We have We have politicians citing their religious faith, citing religious scripture, Christian scripture for their beliefs. So granted, while there isn't a single mandated faith, Christianity in particular has served as that national identity. So on paper, we don't have a national faith identity. And culturally, we do, in that it's Christianity. And when we think about this in particular, right, there isn't the prevention of repudiation of certain practices. So what I mean by that is that it doesn't stop. What you see is the repudiation of other non-Christian faiths, but not of the Christian faith itself. So when we think about this legal system, right, I mentioned in God we trust, and the pledge in the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. We see that within within the pledges, within the pledge, within that phrase. And something to make note, if there was a person who was Muslim or someone who was Sikh, and they wanted to have their faith being represented, immediately they would be repudiated. When we think about the interests of the states, a lot of the interests promote are really underlying the interest of Christianity, right? And this is indirect. Oops. Hold on, I think I broke my keys. And even further, the denial of rights of people with non-Christian faiths or non-religious identities, right? So I know I'm very hard on pro-life, but that's like one of the most main examples. Being cited as pro-life, right? That promotes Christian hegemony, in that women are oppressed, and even further, that promoting the interest in that all life is sacred within the Christian faith. Even further with religious headwear, people who are non-Christian, when they do wear their headwear, people tend to stare, and people are more likely to discriminate against people who are non-Christian. So when you think about a person who's wearing a hijab, they're more, because of the religious headwear that moves people to assume their religious identity, they're more likely to be discriminated against. You think about school, right? The end and beginning of life. Once again, the Pledge of Allegiance, the promotion of creationism, and what you're starting to see within schools, and even within the current Trump administration, right, is that there's this promotion of the Christian faith, of the Christian God into schools, all schools, public schools included. Holidays, another big one. You have a lot of Christian holidays. So the point being, we do see a lot of Christian privilege, Christian hegemony within current day law and education and legal policies of the United States. So now I'm going to talk about the religious right. So this is basically different coalitions of fundamentalist Protestants and conservative Catholics. And within the religious right, what you typically see is the promotion of the collaboration on reducing ideologies or concepts that threaten the Christian religious conviction, traditional religious convictions. So what do I mean by that? There's a lot of anti-LGBT and transgender vitriol within the systemic and interpersonal levels. There's the continual political attacks on pro-LGBT and transgender policies. And when you think about that, for example, let's think about gay marriage, for example, right? That was, let's see, how old was I when that happened? That was about maybe 6 years ago. 5 to 6 years ago. The legalization of gay marriage was not that long ago. Even further, the promotion of healthcare rights for transgender folks was not that long ago. Are the attention to transgender healthcare rights and just rights in general, right? Right. They've always been a thing, and it's not until within recent years that we see the promotion of their rights within the legal system. And even further, you have the religious right promoting or using money, and the religious right are rather wealthy, using money to attack these rights in these policies. Another one, denial of public business services. Now, if you are a private business, that's a whole different story. If you have that on your wall, whole different story. Now, to make note though, if you are in a public business service, the right to deny people their service simply because of their LGBT and transgender identification, that's a whole different story. And so something I want to make note, even further, people who go into healthcare professions. So we have seen cases within the counseling profession where counseling trainees refuse to see or provide services to people who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender, simply citing that it's their faith. Now, my question I want to pose to you is that, how does that bias, that Christian bias, impact the work that you do with, or the work that you perceive that you'll do within the profession? How is that going to impact your work? And so something to think about is that there are denial of the rights of LGBT and transgender folks within the healthcare profession. We see that already. There's substantial evidence of documented discrimination. And even further, what's cited is people's Christian faith. Oh, well, I don't support that because my faith doesn't support it. I didn't realize that, excuse me, let me hold my comment to myself. Even further, what you see is the promotion of Christian concepts in public schoolings and the rolling back of women's rights. When we think about abortion, for example, people cite pro-life as people cite all life being sacred in the eyes of God, of the Christian God, so taken together, I'm saying all this to show that there are substantial ways in which the religious right has contributed to the reduction of different ideologies and concepts that threaten their convictions. And what I mean, their convictions, Christian convictions. So what does this mean for us? And so while this particular lecture wasn't as extensive, this is something that I think that does require more conversations about, given that there are so many different faiths, so many different non-faiths, right? There's diversity in that. And it's really important that we have these conversations. And a lot of times when we talk about religion, it is a touchy subject for people because that's something that they're assigned to when they're born. That's an identity that people are just born into, whether it's religious or non-religious family, right? So when we talk about faith, when we talk about faith oppression, it's really important that we are open. So what are some things that we can do to be more aware of faith oppression and to challenge it? The first step is recognizing that there's so much diversity when it comes to faith and non-faith communities. Um, when we think about these blanket statements, right? They actually undermine this diversity. Buddhists are nonviolent. Atheists think that religion is ridiculous. No, not all people think like that. Um, so, and I recognize that coming from someone uh, who is non-religious, me, um, I think part of that is how we understand people in different faith communities and non-faith communities. There's a lot of stereotypes out there, and so I'll also provide a supplemental video about faith oppression as well, just to help provide more information. The next step in recognizing that there's diversity, challenging Christian privileges if you have them. Well, if you don't have them or if you do, if you have Christian privilege, think about the ways in which that has impacted your way of thinking around people of faith, of other faiths, and of people of non-faiths. What came up for you as I talked about Christian privilege and Christian hegemony. And if you're not Christian, think about the ways that you can safely challenge Christian privilege within the spaces that you occupy. In doing that, you also want to challenge dominant narratives around marginalized faiths and non-faiths group. Within the media, there's substantial evidence of negative portrayals of marginalized faith and non-faith communities. And it's really important to challenge those images and even challenge people's beliefs around these faith and non-faith communities. If you've never met someone who is Muslim, but you see Muslims as being violent, then can you really can you really make it make sense for me? Um, if you've never met an atheist, um, how could you continue to say that atheists think that religion is ridiculous? Have you ever asked an atheist that? So the point is, if walk the talk, and challenge what has been said or challenge what you think. And then lastly, including the voices of people who are not only of the Abrahamic faith, so the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic faith, but people who are Buddhist, people who are Sikh, people who are people who identify as pagan, people who are Satanist. The point being is that the point being of most, not even most, all faiths, uh, in their original form, right? There's a God, or there's gods, and don't be an asshole. Ultimately, that's what they all say. And I want to make note, you don't have to be a person of faith to not be an asshole. You can still be a person of faith and be an asshole. Um, and even further, being an atheist, being agnostic doesn't make you a good person either. Um, the point being is that you have to work towards that, whether you're a Christian, whether you're Christian or Jewish, however you identify, or atheist. Um, it's doing the good work, getting into good trouble, and including the voices um, who haven't been brought to the table. Um, and so the point being is, get out and meet other people. Don't just simply stay in one spot. If it doesn't feel safe for you, then I can understand. And if we want to challenge Christian hegemony and faith oppression, it's really important for us to start with ourselves and move forward. So we talked about a lot of different things here, and I know I kind of rushed this particular lecture, but if there was any information that was unclear, or if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to answer them. Other than that, that's it.